Hey guys, tonight we're exploring one of the strangest and most disturbing stories in European history. The rise and fall of a royal family that became trapped by its own bloodline. If you enjoy relaxing history videos, make sure to subscribe to the channel and settle in for tonight's story. Imagine being born into the most powerful family in Europe. Palaces surround you. Servants obey your every command. Armies march beneath your banners and kings treat your relatives like living legends. From the outside, the Habsburg Dynasty appeared unstoppable. Their family ruled vast territories across Europe for centuries and controlled enormous wealth. Many believed their power would last forever. Yet hidden behind the magnificent castles and golden crowns was a secret that would slowly destroy them from within. The Habsburg rulers became obsessed with keeping power inside the family. Instead of marrying distant nobles, they often married cousins, uncles, nieces, and other close relatives. Each generation believed they were protecting their dynasty. In reality, they were creating a problem that would grow larger with every royal wedding. At first, the consequences were difficult to notice. A child might be slightly weaker than expected. Another family member might suffer from unusual illnesses. These problems seemed small compared to the enormous influence the family possessed. But as decades passed, the effects accumulated. The family tree began to resemble a tangled web rather than a healthy line of descendants. Royal portraits from different centuries reveal something unusual. Many members of the dynasty shared remarkably similar facial features. Their jaws appeared larger and more pronounced than those of ordinary people. Historians would later call this condition the Habsburg Jaw. It became one of the most recognizable symbols of the family. Yet the jaw was only the visible sign of a much deeper problem. Behind the portraits and ceremonial clothing were individuals who often struggled with chronic illness, physical weakness, and developmental difficulties. While common people worried about surviving harsh winters or poor harvests, the rulers of one of Europe's greatest dynasties faced a danger of their own making. They had become prisoners of a tradition that nobody seemed willing to question. Every marriage arranged to strengthen the family only tightened the trap. Few people at the time understood genetics. They could see the symptoms but not the cause. As a result, the cycle continued generation after generation. The dynasty remained powerful on the surface while unseen damage slowly spread through its bloodline. By the 17th century, the consequences had become impossible to ignore. One royal child in particular would eventually become the symbol of everything that had gone wrong. His life would reveal the true cost of centuries of royal inbreeding and bring one of Europe's most powerful families to the edge of collapse. The child was Charles II of Spain. From the moment he entered the world in 1661, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. He belonged to one of the richest royal families on earth. Yet his body was so fragile that many doubted he would survive childhood. He struggled to eat, struggled to speak clearly, and suffered from illnesses that seemed to follow him everywhere. Physicians surrounded him throughout his life, but few could offer meaningful help. They treated symptoms without understanding the true cause hidden within. Generations of family marriages. Charles became king while still young, inheriting a vast empire that stretched across continents. On maps, his territories appeared impressive. Spain controlled valuable colonies, trade routes, and enormous resources. Yet the king himself could barely manage the responsibilities expected of a ruler. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors. Foreign ambassadors sent troubling reports back to their governments. Many believed the Spanish monarchy was slowly weakening under his rule. The tragedy was not that Charles lacked determination. By many accounts, he genuinely wanted to fulfill his duties. The problem was that his health constantly betrayed him. He often suffered from exhaustion and illness. Some days were consumed entirely by medical treatments and religious rituals designed to restore his strength. During this period, Europe watched carefully. Rival kingdoms understood that the future of Spain depended on whether Charles could produce an heir. A healthy son would continue the dynasty and preserve stability. But year after year, no heir appeared. The pressure became enormous. Royal advisors worried about succession. Noble families prepared for possible political chaos. Entire governments calculated what might happen if the Spanish branch of the Habsburg family came to an end. Meanwhile, portraits of Charles reveal a lonely figure trapped by circumstances beyond his control. He had inherited not only a throne, but also the consequences of decisions made long before he was born. Every cousin marriage, every attempt to preserve royal blood, had contributed to the condition he carried. Modern historians studying the Habsburg family tree discovered just how extreme the situation had become. Some generations contained so many close family marriages that the genetic similarity between husband and wife was far higher than normal. The dynasty had spent centuries narrowing its own bloodline. What once seemed like a strategy for preserving power was now threatening the future of an empire. As Charles grew older, the question became impossible to avoid. What would happen when the last Habsburg king of Spain died without an heir? The answer would shake Europe and trigger a struggle that kings, generals, and diplomats had feared for decades. When Charles II died in 1700, the fears that had haunted Europe for years suddenly became reality. He left no children and no direct successor capable of continuing the Spanish Habsburg line. After centuries of power, wealth, and influence, one of Europe's greatest royal dynasties had reached a dead end. The news spread rapidly across the continent. In royal courts from London to Vienna, leaders understood that this was far more than a family tragedy. The Spanish Empire possessed enormous territories and valuable resources. Whoever inherited those lands could dramatically shift the balance of power in Europe. Almost immediately, rival claims emerged. Different royal families argued that they had the strongest right to the Spanish throne. Diplomats exchanged letters, negotiations intensified, and alliances formed. But words alone could not settle the dispute. Soon, armies began to move. The conflict that followed became known as the War of the Spanish Succession. Across Europe, soldiers marched through fields, forests, and cities. Battles erupted in multiple countries. Thousands of ordinary people who had never heard of genetics or royal family trees found themselves caught in a war that had roots in generations of aristocratic marriage decisions. Villagers suffered, economies strained under the weight of military campaigns. Powerful kingdoms spent vast fortunes trying to shape the future of Europe. It was a dramatic ending to a story that had begun centuries earlier with a simple belief that royal blood must remain pure. Ironically, the policy designed to preserve Habsburg power had achieved the opposite result. Instead of guaranteeing stability, it helped create uncertainty, conflict, and eventually the collapse of an entire branch of the dynasty. Today, historians often use the Habsburgs as one of history's most famous examples of the dangers of extreme inbreeding. Modern science allows researchers to examine family trees with far greater accuracy than people possessed centuries ago. The evidence reveals just how concentrated the dynasty's bloodline became over time. Yet it is important to remember that the people involved did not fully understand what was happening. They acted according to traditions, political pressures, and beliefs that were common among Europe's ruling elites. Many genuinely thought they were protecting their family's future. Instead, they unknowingly weakened it. The magnificent palaces, priceless treasures, and royal ceremonies often capture our attention when we study the Habsburgs. But behind the glittering surface lies a cautionary tale about power, ambition, and unintended consequences. The story reminds us that even the mightiest families are not immune to the laws of nature. And while the Spanish branch had fallen, the wider Habsburg legacy still stretched across Europe, leaving behind mysteries, scandals, and fascinating stories that continue to intrigue historians centuries later. Although the Spanish branch of the family disappeared, the Habsburg name did not vanish overnight. In Central Europe, other members of the dynasty continued to rule powerful lands, especially within Austria. Their palaces remained symbols of prestige and authority. Visit admired, grand, decorated with gold, en ormeau chandelier, and portraits of rulers stretching back through generations. Yet, even as their influence survived, the lessons of the past became increasingly difficult to ignore. By the 18th century, Europe itself was changing. New scientific ideas were spreading. Scholars questioned old traditions and searched for rational explanations behind disease and inheritance. Concepts that would later become part of modern genetics were still far away. But people were beginning to understand that family relationships could influence health in unexpected ways. The Habsburg experience became a topic of fascination among historians and physicians alike. Some researchers spent years studying royal records, birth certificates, marriage contracts, and portraits. They traced connections between relatives and discovered just how interconnected the dynasty had become. In certain cases, individuals appeared in the family tree multiple times because the same bloodlines repeatedly merged through marriage. What looked like a vast royal network was, in reality, becoming increasingly narrow. Meanwhile, ordinary people often viewed royal families with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Kings and queens seemed distant, almost mythical. Their clothing, wealth, and ceremonies created an image of perfection. Yet the Habsburg story revealed a very human truth. Behind the crowns were families facing problems, just as real as those experienced by anyone else. Power could buy armies and palaces, but it could not always protect a family from the consequences of its own decisions. One reason this story continues to fascinate modern audiences is that it combines history, politics, science, and human drama. It is not simply a tale about a royal dynasty. It is also a reminder of how small choices, repeated across generations, can eventually produce enormous consequences. A marriage arranged for political advantage might seem insignificant at the time, but when similar decisions are repeated again and again, the results can reshape entire nations. Today, tourists walking through former Habsburg palaces often admire the beautiful architecture without realizing the remarkable story hidden behind those walls. Every portrait and every royal chamber belongs to a dynasty that once believed its power would last forever. Yet history proved otherwise. The rise of the Habsburgs was extraordinary, but their struggles remind us that no empire, no family, and no ruler remains untouched by time. And some of the most dramatic chapters of their story were still unfolding long after the famous Habsburg Jaw had become a symbol recognised throughout Europe. As the 19th century arrived, the world that had created the Habsburg Dynasty was slowly disappearing. Revolutions, industrial growth, and new political ideas were transforming Europe. People increasingly questioned the belief that certain families were destined to rule simply because of their birth. Newspapers spread information faster than ever before, and royal families found themselves living under a level of public attention that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. The Habsburg rulers adapted as best they could, but they were now governing a complicated empire filled with different languages, cultures, and traditions. Managing such diversity required skill, diplomacy, and constant compromise. The days when a royal decree alone could solve every problem were fading away. Yet despite political challenges, the dynasty remained one of the most influential forces in Europe. Their family connections linked them to numerous royal houses across the continent. Marriages still played an important role in diplomacy, though attitudes toward close family unions gradually became more cautious than they had been centuries earlier. The memory of past problems lingered. Historians and physicians continued discussing the lessons hidden within the dynasty's long history. Then came one of the most famous figures associated with the Habsburg world, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Few people could have predicted that his fate would become connected to one of the most important events in modern history. In 1914, while visiting Sarajevo, he and his wife were assassinated. The attack shocked Europe. What followed was a chain reaction of alliances, declarations, and military mobilizations. Within weeks, much of the continent was heading toward war. The conflict that became known as World War I would change history forever. Millions of soldiers entered battlefields stretching across Europe and beyond. Entire societies were transformed by the scale of the fighting. When the war finally ended, several ancient empires collapsed, including the Austro-Hungarian Empire ruled by the Habsburg Dynasty. After centuries of influence, the family that had once dominated large parts of Europe lost its imperial throne. It was an extraordinary conclusion to a story that had begun hundreds of years earlier. From powerful medieval rulers to emperors commanding vast territories, the Habsburgs had shaped European history in countless ways. Their victories, mistakes, ambitions, and family traditions left marks that can still be seen today. What makes their story so memorable is not only the scale of their power, but also the contrast between public glory and private struggles. Behind every royal portrait stood real people facing fears, expectations, and consequences they could not always control. The dynasty's rise demonstrated how far ambition could carry a family. Its challenges revealed the hidden costs that sometimes accompanied that success. And for historians, the Habsburgs remain one of the most fascinating examples of how personal decisions can influence the course of entire nations. Even after losing their empire, the Habsburgs did not disappear from history. Former palaces became museums. Royal residences opened their doors to visitors. And historians continued uncovering details about the family's extraordinary past. Tourists walking through vast corridors in Vienna often pause before enormous portraits of emperors, empresses, princes, and princesses. At first glance, these paintings seem to tell a story of endless wealth and success. But the deeper one looks, the more complicated the picture becomes. Many of the faces staring from the walls belong to people carrying immense responsibilities. From childhood, their lives were carefully planned long before they could make decisions for themselves. Marriages, careers, friendships, and even daily routines were often determined by politics rather than personal choice. A prince might marry someone he barely knew because an alliance needed strengthening. A princess could be sent hundreds of miles away to a foreign court in service of diplomatic goals. Their personal happiness frequently came second to the interests of the dynasty. This reality helps explain why family traditions became so powerful. When rulers constantly worried about losing territory or influence, marrying relatives sometimes appeared safer than trusting outsiders. Over time, however, what seemed politically useful created biological risks that nobody fully understood. Today, scientists can study DNA and inheritance with remarkable precision. Looking back, researchers have identified patterns that help explain many of the health problems recorded among certain Habsburg family members. These discoveries transformed the dynasty into one of the most frequently discussed historical examples in conversations about genetics. Yet, reducing their story to genetics alone would miss something important. The Habsburgs were not merely a medical case study. They were rulers, diplomats, soldiers, artists, and patrons of culture. They funded magnificent buildings, supported music and education, and influenced events that shaped the modern world. Some members were admired for intelligence and leadership, while others became famous for controversy or failure. Like any family, their history contained triumphs and tragedies side by side. Perhaps that is why their story remains so captivating centuries later. It reminds us that history is rarely simple. The same dynasty that built great institutions also made decisions that contributed to its own difficulties. The same rulers who commanded armies could be vulnerable to problems hidden within their own family line. Their journey spans hundreds of years and countless lives, creating a story filled with ambition, power, mistakes, and unexpected consequences. And among all the lessons left behind by the Habsburgs, one stands out most clearly. Sometimes the greatest threats to a powerful empire do not come from invading armies or foreign enemies, but from choices made quietly within the walls of its own palace. The legacy of the Habsburg Dynasty can still be seen across Europe today. Their castles stand on hilltops, their palaces dominate city centres, and their influence remains woven into countless historical records. In many ways, they achieved what every ruling family dreams of achieving. Their name survived for centuries and became known throughout the world. Yet their story is remembered not only because of their successes, but because it reveals how fragile power can be. A dynasty may control armies, collect enormous wealth, and govern millions of people, but it cannot escape the consequences of human decisions forever. Historians often wonder whether the Habsburgs could have avoided many of their problems. What if they had married more widely outside their own family? What if tradition had been challenged earlier? What if political leaders had placed long-term health above short-term alliances? These questions can never be answered with certainty. History offers no opportunity for a second attempt. We can only examine what happened and try to understand why. The surviving letters of royal advisors reveal that some people occasionally expressed concern about the repeated marriages between relatives. However, challenging established customs inside a powerful royal court was never easy. Traditions that had existed for generations often appeared unquestionable. Each ruler inherited not only a throne but also expectations built by countless ancestors. As a result, the cycle continued much longer than it otherwise might have. Looking back from the modern world, the Habsburg story feels almost unbelievable. It contains everything that makes history fascinating: kings and queens, enormous empires, political intrigue, scientific mystery, family drama, and the rise and fall of a dynasty that once seemed invincible. Few historical families left such a detailed record of both their achievements and their struggles. Their portraits still hang in museums. Their palaces continue attracting visitors. Their names appear in books, documentaries, and academic studies. Centuries after many of them died, people remain curious about their lives. Perhaps that enduring fascination exists because the story speaks to something universal. The Habsburgs were extraordinarily powerful, yet they faced the same reality that confronts every family. Choices made in one generation can affect the next. Decisions that seem beneficial in the present may create unexpected consequences in the future. No amount of wealth or influence can completely remove that truth. And so the history of the Habsburg Dynasty remains more than the story of a royal family. It is a reminder that power has limits, that traditions should sometimes be questioned, and that even the mightiest rulers are ultimately subject to the same human realities as everyone else. There is another reason historians remain fascinated by the Habsburgs. Unlike many ancient dynasties that disappeared into legend, the Habsburg family left behind an enormous collection of records, brevet documents, portraits, diaries, and official reports allow modern researchers to reconstruct their lives in remarkable detail. We can follow their triumphs, their fears, their ambitions, and even some of their private conversations. Few royal families are documented so thoroughly. Through these records, we discover that life inside a royal palace was not always as glamorous as it appeared from the outside. Court ceremonies could last for hours. Strict rules governed everything from clothing to dining etiquette. Young princes and princesses were expected to behave according to standards. That left little room for ordinary childhood experiences. Every action could be observed, judged, and remembered. For many members of the dynasty, the burden of expectation never disappeared. Some spent their entire lives trying to live up to the reputation of famous ancestors. Others struggled beneath responsibilities they never asked to inherit. The public often imagined kings and queens enjoying unlimited freedom. But in reality, many lived within invisible walls created by tradition and duty. The Habsburg rulers were expected to protect their territories, maintain alliances, oversee complex governments, and preserve the prestige of their family. Failure in any of these areas could have consequences, reaching far beyond the palace gates. Meanwhile, Europe itself continued changing around them. New technologies emerged. Trade expanded. Scientific discoveries challenged long-held beliefs. Societies evolved in ways that earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. Yet some traditions within royal circles changed far more slowly. This tension between old customs and a changing world became one of the defining challenges faced by many ruling families. The Habsburgs were no exception. Their story demonstrates how difficult it can be for powerful institutions to adapt. Success often creates confidence, and confidence can sometimes lead people to believe that existing methods will always work. For centuries, the dynasty had survived wars, political crises, and economic difficulties. Many probably assumed it would survive future challenges as well. But history rarely guarantees permanence. Every empire eventually encounters problems that cannot be solved, using the strategies of the past. That is one reason the Habsburg narrative continues to feel relevant today. It is not simply about a royal family from long ago. It is about the dangers of complacency, the consequences of repeating old patterns without question, and the importance of adapting when circumstances change. Their experience reminds us that strength and vulnerability often exist side by side. And sometimes the warning signs of future trouble appear long before anyone fully understands what they mean. Perhaps the most remarkable part of the Habsburg story is how it continues to influence discussions centuries after the dynasty lost its throne. Students study the family when learning about European politics. Scientists examine their history when discussing inheritance and genetics. Travellers encounter their legacy in museums, castles, and former imperial capitals. Very few royal families have remained so relevant for so long after their political power disappeared. One reason is that the Habsburgs occupied a unique position in history. They stood at the centre of countless major events. Their decisions affected wars, alliances, trade routes, and the lives of millions of people. Entire generations grew up under rulers carrying the Habsburg name. As a result, understanding their story helps explain how Europe developed into the continent we know today. Yet, for all their influence, the dynasty's history ultimately returns to a surprisingly simple lesson. Human beings often believe they can control the future through careful planning. The Habsburg rulers arranged marriages to secure alliances. They negotiated treaties to protect their lands. They built institutions designed to preserve their power for generations. In many cases, these strategies worked remarkably well. Their family remained influential far longer than most dynasties. But history has a way of producing outcomes nobody expects. The very policy intended to strengthen the family gradually introduced new vulnerabilities. What appeared wise in one century could create difficulties in the next. This pattern appears throughout history, not only among royal families. Businesses, governments, and societies sometimes continue following successful traditions long after circumstances have changed. The challenge lies in recognizing when adaptation becomes necessary. Looking at the portraits of Habsburg rulers today, it is easy to focus on their crowns, uniforms, and symbols of authority. Yet beneath those outward signs were individuals living in uncertain times. They worried about succession, security, health, and the future of their families, just as people do today. Some achieved great accomplishments. Others made serious mistakes. Most experienced a mixture of both. That human dimension is what transforms their history from a collection of dates into a compelling story. The Habsburg Dynasty rose from relative obscurity to become one of the most powerful ruling families the world had ever seen. It survived wars, rebellions, and political crises that might have destroyed weaker powers. Yet, even such extraordinary success could not guarantee permanence. Time continued moving forward. Generations passed. Circumstances changed. Eventually, the empire faded into history. But the questions raised by their experience remain as fascinating now as they were centuries ago, encouraging historians to keep searching through archives for new clues about one of Europe's most extraordinary dynasties. As researchers continued examining the history of the Habsburg Dynasty, they uncovered stories that were far more complex than the simple image often presented in popular culture. It is easy to remember the family only for the famous Habsburg Jaw or the consequences of repeated marriages between relatives. But the dynasty's influence extended into nearly every aspect of European life. They sponsored artists, supported universities, financed churches, and oversaw major construction projects that still stand today. Some of Europe's most beautiful palaces, libraries, and collections owe part of their existence to Habsburg patronage. Walking through these places today creates a strange contrast. Visitors admire magnificent architecture, while also knowing that behind the grandeur were generations of rulers dealing with increasingly difficult challenges. This combination of achievement and vulnerability makes the dynasty especially fascinating. History rarely presents heroes or villains in simple terms. More often, it presents people making decisions based on the information available to them at the time. The Habsburgs believed they were protecting their family's future. They could not see the long-term consequences that modern science would later reveal. In many ways, they were trapped by the same traditions that had helped them rise to power. The success of earlier generations encouraged later rulers to continue following familiar paths. Changing course would have required questioning customs that many considered essential to the survival of the dynasty. As decades passed, those customs became deeply woven into the identity of the royal family itself. By the time serious problems became visible, altering centuries of tradition was no easy task. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout history. Institutions often become attached to practices that once worked well, even when circumstances begin to change. The challenge lies in recognizing danger before it becomes impossible to ignore. Looking back, historians can identify warning signs that were visible long before the Spanish branch of the family disappeared. Yet people living at the time rarely have the advantage of hindsight. They must make decisions without knowing how the story will end. That uncertainty is one reason history remains so compelling. The people who lived it could not see the future any more clearly than we can see our own. The Habsburgs built an empire that lasted for centuries, but they could never fully predict the consequences of their choices. Their story reminds us that power does not eliminate uncertainty. Even rulers commanding vast armies and enormous wealth must navigate a future filled with unknowns. And sometimes the decisions that appear safest in the present can produce the greatest surprises for generations yet to come. Today, the Habsburg Dynasty exists mostly in history books, museums, and the memories of the cities it once ruled. Yet its story continues to attract millions of people because it feels almost impossible to believe. How could a family become so powerful that it controlled enormous parts of Europe, only to face problems that no army or fortress could prevent? The answer lies in the complicated relationship between power and human nature. Throughout history, rulers have often tried to secure their position by controlling as many risks as possible. They formed alliances, arranged marriages, accumulated wealth, and built institutions designed to protect their families. The Habsburgs did all of these things with remarkable success. For generations, their strategy appeared to work. Their territories expanded. Their influence grew. Their relatives occupied thrones across Europe. To many observers, they seemed destined to remain powerful forever. Yet history repeatedly teaches the same lesson. No system is perfect. Every strategy carries hidden weaknesses, even when those weaknesses remain invisible for many years. In the Habsburg case, one of those weaknesses slowly developed within the family itself. The effects appeared gradually rather than all at once, because the changes happened over generations. Many people failed to recognize the full danger until it became impossible to ignore. This gradual process makes the story especially fascinating. Empires rarely collapse overnight. More often, small problems accumulate year after year. Each individual issue may appear manageable, but together they create challenges that eventually become overwhelming. The Habsburg experience demonstrates how long-term consequences can emerge from decisions repeated across centuries. It also reminds us that historical figures were not living inside a story whose ending they already knew. They were navigating uncertainty just like everyone else. A royal marriage that seems questionable today may have appeared perfectly reasonable at the time. Political leaders often acted according to the knowledge available to them, not according to information that would only be discovered hundreds of years later. This perspective helps explain why history should be approached with curiosity rather than judgment. Understanding the past requires understanding the world as people experienced it. For the Habsburgs, the world was filled with concerns about succession, diplomacy, war, and survival. Their choices were shaped by those realities. The result was a dynasty that achieved extraordinary success while also creating challenges that would haunt future generations. And as historians continue exploring archives and uncovering forgotten details, the Habsburg story remains a powerful reminder that the greatest forces shaping history are often not battles or revolutions alone, but the countless decisions made by ordinary human beings trying to secure an uncertain future. The longer historians study the Habsburg Dynasty, the more they realise that its story is not only about royalty. It is also about the unexpected ways in which history unfolds. If someone living in Europe during the height of Habsburg power had been asked which threat would eventually weaken the dynasty, they might have pointed to rival kingdoms, invading arm, economic crisis, or political rebellions. Very few would have imagined that some of the most serious problems would emerge from decisions made inside royal family circles. That is one reason the story continues to surprise modern audiences. It challenges common assumptions about power. We often imagine that the strongest people have complete control over their future. Yet the Habsburg experience demonstrates that influence has limits. Even emperors cannot control every consequence of their actions. In many ways, the dynasty became a victim of its own success. The family accumulated so much power that preserving that power became its highest priority. Policies that seemed beneficial in one generation were repeated in the next. Traditions became habits, and habits eventually became expectations. Over time, questioning those expectations grew increasingly difficult. Historians examining royal correspondence sometimes discover hints of concern among advisors and diplomats. Certain observers noticed recurring health issues. Others worried about succession problems. Some recognised that the family tree was becoming unusually interconnected. Yet awareness alone rarely produces change. Powerful institutions often move slowly, especially when long-established customs are involved. The Habsburg court was no exception. Meanwhile, ordinary people living under Habsburg rule continued their daily lives. Farmers worked fields, merchants traded goods, craftsmen practiced their skills, and families raised children. Most never entered a royal palace. Yet decisions made by distant rulers could affect taxes, laws, military service, and countless other aspects of life. This connection between private choices and public consequences is one of the most important themes in history. Actions taken by a small group of individuals can sometimes influence millions of people. The Habsburg story illustrates this principle with remarkable clarity. What began as a strategy for maintaining political stability eventually contributed to uncertainty across Europe. Generations later, historians can trace those connections and see patterns that were difficult to recognise at the time. That ability to look backward is one of history's greatest strengths. It allows us to understand how events are linked across decades and even centuries. And when we follow the Habsburg journey from its rise to its decline, we discover a dynasty whose greatest legacy may not be its wealth or its empire, but the lessons it leaves behind about power, tradition, and the unpredictable consequences of human decisions. In recent years, advances in technology have allowed researchers to examine the Habsburg family with a level of detail that earlier historians could only dream about. Digital archives have made thousands of historical documents easier to access, while modern scientific methods have helped scholars better understand the medical conditions described in centuries-old records. As a result, the dynasty continues to reveal new secrets long after its political power disappeared. Some researchers focus on royal letters, searching for clues about how family members viewed the challenges around them. Others analyse portraits, comparing physical features across generations. Still others study diplomatic reports written by foreign ambassadors who spent years observing life inside Habsburg courts. Together, these sources create a remarkably detailed picture of a dynasty struggling to balance tradition with survival. One particularly interesting discovery is how often royal image differed from reality. Public ceremonies were carefully designed to project strength and stability. Portraits presented rulers as confident, healthy, and powerful. Official announcements emphasized success rather than weakness. Maintaining this image was considered essential because political authority depended partly on public perception. A ruler who appeared vulnerable could encourage rivals to challenge his position. For that reason, many difficulties remained hidden from the wider public whenever possible. Yet private documents often tell a different story. Behind closed doors, advisors worried about succession. Physicians discussed chronic illnesses. Diplomats speculated about the future of the dynasty. These concerns rarely appeared in official celebrations, but they formed an important part of daily life within the palace. This contrast between appearance and reality makes the Habsburg story feel surprisingly modern. Even today, institutions often work hard to present an image of confidence while dealing with complex problems. Behind the scenes, human nature has changed less than we sometimes imagine. People still seek stability, fear uncertainty, and try to protect what they value most. The Habsburg rulers were no different. They wanted security for their family and continuity for their empire. The tragedy is that some of the methods used to achieve those goals ultimately contributed to the challenges they faced. Looking across the centuries, it becomes clear that history is rarely shaped by a single event. Instead, it emerges from countless decisions interacting over long periods of time. The Habsburg dynasty rose through generations of strategic planning, political alliances, and determined leadership. Its difficulties also developed gradually, influenced by choices repeated over centuries. This mixture of success and failure is what makes the dynasty such a fascinating subject. It reminds us that even the most powerful families are part of a larger historical process, one that no individual ruler can completely control. Perhaps the greatest reason the Habsburg story continues to endure is because it feels less like the history of a distant royal family and more like a lesson about human nature itself. Every generation inherits decisions made by those who came before. Sometimes those decisions create opportunities. Sometimes they create burdens. Most often, they create a mixture of both. The Habsburg rulers inherited an empire built through centuries of ambition, diplomacy, and careful planning. They also inherited traditions that became increasingly difficult to change. The combination shaped the destiny of the dynasty for hundreds of years. Looking back, it is tempting to assume that the outcome was inevitable. Yet people living at the time could not see the future. Each ruler believed he was acting in the best interests of the family and the state. Every marriage agreement, political alliance, and succession plan seemed designed to preserve stability. The fact that some of those choices later produced unintended consequences does not mean they appeared foolish at the moment they were made. History is filled with similar examples. Decisions often look very different when viewed through the lens of centuries. That is why the Habsburg Dynasty remains such a valuable subject of study. It teaches us to think beyond immediate results and consider long-term effects. It reminds us that power can create confidence, but confidence should never replace reflection. Most importantly, it shows that no family, institution, or empire is immune to change. Time reshapes everything. The castles remain, the portraits survive, and the records endure. But the world that once revolved around the Habsburg name has long since passed into history. What remains are the stories. Stories of emperors and kings, of triumph and tragedy, of decisions that altered the course of nations. And among those stories, few are more fascinating than the tale of a dynasty that rose higher than almost any other in Europe, only to discover that even the strongest foundations can contain hidden cracks. As historians continue examining the lives of the Habsburgs, new details will undoubtedly emerge. Yet the central lesson remains unchanged. Great power may shape history, but it can never completely escape the consequences of human choices. That truth, perhaps more than anything else, explains why the story of the Habsburg Dynasty continues to captivate people centuries after the last of its great rulers disappeared from the stage of history. Even after everything we have discussed, the Habsburg story still leaves one final question. Why do people continue talking about this dynasty hundreds of years after its decline? The answer may be because it combines two things that always capture human attention: extraordinary success and unexpected failure. The Habsburgs achieved what countless families could only dream of. Their influence stretched across borders, languages, and generations. They helped shape the political map of Europe and left behind monuments that still attract visitors from around the world. Yet their story also reminds us that success does not guarantee permanence. Every empire, no matter how powerful, exists within the limits of time. New generations arrive. Circumstances change. Challenges emerge that previous leaders never anticipated. The Habsburgs experienced this reality just as countless other dynasties have. Throughout history, their rise was remarkable, but their decline was equally instructive. Today, when tourists walk through former imperial palaces, they often admire the beauty of the buildings without realizing how many personal struggles unfolded within those walls. Behind every throne sat a human being facing uncertainty. Behind every royal portrait was a life filled with hopes, fears, responsibilities, and difficult choices. That human element is what transforms history from a collection of names. and dates into something meaningful. The Habsburg Dynasty may no longer rule an empire, but its story continues to offer valuable lessons. It teaches the importance of adaptation. It highlights the risks of blindly following tradition. It demonstrates how decisions can echo across generations in ways nobody expects. Most of all, it reminds us that power and vulnerability often exist side by side. A family can appear invincible while quietly facing problems hidden from the world. As we reach the end of this chapter, the Habsburgs remain one of history's most fascinating examples of how greatness and fragility can coexist. Their castles still stand. Their portraits still watch from museum walls. Their legacy continues to inspire debate among historians, scientists, and curious readers alike. And perhaps that is the true measure of their impact. Not that they ruled for centuries, but that their story still encourages people to reflect on the complicated relationship between ambition, tradition, and the passage of time. There is also something strangely ironic about the Habsburg Dynasty. For centuries, its rulers worked tirelessly to secure their family's future. They negotiated alliances, arranged strategic marriages, expanded territories, and accumulated immense wealth. Every generation believed it was strengthening the foundation laid by those who came before. Yet history often unfolds in unexpected ways. The very actions intended to guarantee stability sometimes created new challenges that could not be seen until much later. This irony is one reason historians continue returning to the Habsburgs. Their story demonstrates how difficult it can be to predict the long-term consequences of present decisions. A choice that appears sensible in one era may produce problems in another. Looking at the dynasty today, we can see patterns that were invisible to many people living at the time. That perspective is one of history's greatest gifts. It allows us to connect events separated by decades or even centuries. The Habsburg experience also reminds us that individuals rarely control history on their own. Emperors, kings, queens, advisors, diplomats, soldiers, and ordinary citizens all played roles in shaping the world around them. The rise and fall of the dynasty was not the result of a single decision or a single ruler. It emerged from countless actions taken across generations. Some decisions strengthened the empire, others weakened it. Together they created a story far more complicated than any simple explanation could capture. That complexity is what makes history so fascinating. Real events rarely follow a straight path. Success is often mixed with failure. Strength exists alongside weakness. Ambition produces achievements, but can also create risks. The Habsburg dynasty contained all of these contradictions. It was at once one of the most successful ruling families in European history, and one of the most famous examples of how power can create unexpected vulnerabilities. Centuries have passed since the height of their influence, yet their story remains alive because it speaks to timeless questions. How should power be used? When should traditions be preserved? And when should they be challenged? How can people prepare for consequences they cannot yet see? These questions mattered during the age of emperors, and they still matter today. The Habsburgs may belong to the past, but the lessons hidden within their history continue to feel surprisingly modern. ensuring that their remarkable story will be remembered for generations to come. As the years pass, new generations continue discovering the Habsburg Dynasty for the first time. Some encounter the story through documentaries. Others learn about it in school or while visiting historic cities such as Vienna, Madrid, or Prague. No matter how people find the story, many are surprised by how relevant it still feels. The world has changed dramatically since the age of emperors and royal courts. Yet many of the challenges faced by the Habsburgs remain familiar. People still struggle to balance tradition with change. Governments still worry about long-term stability. Families still make decisions they hope will benefit future generations. The details may be different, but the underlying human questions remain remarkably similar. This connection between past and present is what gives history its power. The Habsburgs are not interesting simply because they wore crowns or ruled vast territories. They are interesting because their experiences reveal patterns that appear again and again throughout human history. Ambition drives success. Success creates confidence. Confidence can sometimes lead people to ignore warning signs. Then circumstances change, forcing difficult adjustments. This cycle has repeated itself in kingdoms, businesses, governments, and societies across the world. The Habsburg Dynasty provides one of the clearest examples of how that process can unfold over centuries. At their peak, they seemed almost unstoppable. Their influence reached across Europe and beyond. Yet, even the strongest dynasties could not control every outcome. Unexpected consequences emerged. New challenges appeared. The world evolved around them. Eventually, the empire that once dominated so much of Europe became part of history. But perhaps that is not the end of the story. In another sense, the Habsburgs never truly disappeared. Their legacy survives in architecture, culture, art, politics, and historical memory. Every visitor who walks through a former imperial palace, every student who reads about European history, and every researcher who studies their family tree keeps part of that legacy alive. The dynasty may have lost its throne, but it gained something different. A permanent place in the historical imagination. Few families achieve that. Centuries after their greatest rulers have passed away, people still discuss their choices, debate their decisions, and search for lessons hidden within their remarkable journey. And that enduring fascination may be the final reminder that while empires entfall, stories have a way of lasting far longer than the kingdoms that created them. Perhaps the most important thing to remember about the Habsburg dynasty is that history is rarely as simple as it first appears. It can be tempting to reduce centuries of events to a single explanation, but real history is made of countless interconnected stories, political ambitions, family traditions, economic pressures, personal relationships, wars, accidents, and unexpected circumstances all combine to shape outcomes. The Habsburgs were no exception. Their successes were not caused by one decision alone, and neither were their failures. Instead, their story unfolded gradually across generations, with each ruler adding a new chapter to a much larger narrative. Some inherited prosperity and expanded it. Others inherited problems and struggled to solve them. Together they created one of the longest and most influential dynastic histories in Europe. The back we can admire their achievements while also learning from their mistakes. That balance is essential when studying the past. History is not about celebrating or condemning people who lived centuries ago. It is about understanding them. The Habsburg rulers lived in a world very different from our own. They faced pressures, expectations, and beliefs that shaped the choices they made. Understanding those circumstances helps us see why events unfolded the way they did. It also reminds us that future generations may one day look back on our own era with similar curiosity. They too will wonder why certain decisions seemed reasonable, why certain traditions endured, and why people acted as they did. Insätze der Habsburgsbor more a tale about emperors and kings. It becomes a reflection on how human societies operate across time. Every generation inherits both advantages and challenges from those who came before. What we choose to preserve, change, or ignore helps determine the future. The Habsburg Dynasty offers a powerful example of this process. Their rise demonstrated the extraordinary possibilities created by ambition and determination. Their struggles revealed the risks of becoming too attached to old assumptions, and their legacy continues to encourage reflection. Centuries after their empire vanished, that may be why historians never seem to tire of studying them. The story contains mystery, drama, triumph, tragedy, and lessons that remain relevant long after the final emperor left the throne. Few dynasties have left such a rich and complicated record behind, and few continue to capture the imagination quite like the Habsburgs, whose remarkable journey remains one of the most fascinating chapters in the long history of Europe. Yet, even after centuries of research, the Habsburg dynasty still leaves historians with unanswered questions. What private conversations took place behind palace doors that were never recorded? How many concerns were discussed among family members but never written down? What thoughts passed through the minds of rulers who sensed that their world was changing around them? History provides many clues, but it rarely provides every answer. That uncertainty is part of what makes the past so fascinating. We can examine letters, official records, portraits, and eyewitness accounts, yet there will always be details lost to time. The Habsburgs ruled for so long that entire generations lived and died under their authority. Children were born, grew old, and passed away without ever knowing a world in which the dynasty was not influential. For them, Habsburg rule seemed permanent. It was simply part of life. But history teaches us that nothing remains unchanged forever. Even the most powerful institutions eventually face moments of transformation. New ideas emerge. Old systems weaken. Circumstances evolve in ways that nobody fully expects. The Habsburg Empire experienced these changes, just as every great power before it had done. What makes their story unique is the extraordinary amount of evidence they left behind. Because so much documentation survives, modern readers can follow their journey almost step by step. We can witness their rise, observe their triumphs, and understand the challenges that gradually accumulated over time. Few dynasties offer such a detailed window into the past. That is why the Habsburgs continue appearing in books, documentaries, museum exhibitions, and historical discussions. Their story contains nearly every element that makes history compelling. There is ambition, wealth, diplomacy, conflict, scientific mystery, family drama, and political intrigue. More importantly, there are human beings trying to navigate an uncertain future. Despite their crowns and titles, they faced many of the same fears that people face today. They worried about their families, their health, their legacy, and what would happen after they were gone. Those concerns connect us to them across the centuries. The world they inhabited may be gone, but the emotions and challenges they experienced remain familiar. And perhaps that is the final reason their story continues to endure. The Habsburg Dynasty reminds us that history is not only about empires and rulers. It is also about people. People making choices, responding to circumstances, and leaving behind consequences that echo far beyond their own lifetimes. As we move further away from the age of emperors and royal courts, the Habsburg Dynasty becomes easier to study, but no less fascinating. Distance allows historians to examine events with greater objectivity, instead of seeing the family only through the lens of politics or legend. Researchers can explore the full complexity of their world. What emerges is a picture of a dynasty filled with both remarkable achievements and profound challenges. Their rulers governed vast territories, influenced international affairs, and helped shape the course of European history. At the same time, they struggled with many of the limitations that affect all human beings. They faced and made mistakes, and dealt with consequences they could not always foresee. This combination of power and vulnerability is what gives their story such lasting appeal. It reminds us that no matter how great a person or institution becomes, it remains subject to the realities of life. The Habsburgs could command armies, negotiate treaties, and build magnificent palaces, but they could not completely control the future. No ruler. History is shaped by countless factors, interacting in ways that are often impossible to predict. One decision influences another. One generation affects the next. Small choices sometimes produce enormous results decades later. The Habsburg Dynasty provides a vivid example of this process unfolding over centuries. Their story stretches across so much time that it almost feels like watching an entire civilization evolve. New rulers replaced old ones. Borders shifted. Technologies changed. Ideas transformed societies. Yet through it all, the dynasty remained connected by a shared history and a belief in its own continuity. Eventually, however, even that continuity came to an end. The empire disappeared, but the story remained. Today, the Habsburgs survive not as rulers but as historical figures whose lives continue to spark curiosity and debate. Their experiences encourage us to think about leadership, tradition, adaptation, and the long-term effects of human decisions. Few dynasties offer so many opportunities for reflection, and perhaps that is why their history continues to captivate audiences around the world. It is not merely a tale about the past. It is a reminder that every generation leaves something behind for those who follow. Whether that legacy becomes a source of strength or a source of difficulty often depends on choices that seem ordinary at the time. The Habsburgs understood many things about power, but like all people, they could never fully know how history would remember them. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of the Habsburg story is that it never truly reaches a simple ending. Unlike a novel History does not conclude when a dynasty loses power, though consequences of past events continue influencing the future long after the original participants are gone. The Habsburg Empire vanished, but many of the institutions, cultural traditions, and historical developments connected to it continued shaping Europe for generations. Cities that once served as imperial centres remained important long after the last emperor stepped down. Buildings commissioned centuries ago still dominate skylines. Archives filled with royal documents continue, providing new information to researchers. In Sisvir, the dynasty's influence extends far beyond the years in which it actually ruled. This lasting impact highlights an important truth about history. People often imagine that great events are created only by famous individuals. While leaders certainly matter, history is also built by countless ordinary people whose names rarely appear in textbooks. Farmers, merchants, soldiers, craftsmen, servants, teachers, and families all contributed to the world the Habsburgs governed. Their lives formed the foundation upon which imperial power rested. Without them, even the most powerful dynasty could not function. Remembering this broader perspective helps us see history as something larger than kings and queens alone. The Habsburg story is not only about rulers sitting on thrones. It is about entire societies changing over time. It is about traditions being preserved, challenged, and transformed. It is about human beings trying to create stability in a world that is constantly evolving. These themes remain relevant regardless of the century. Every generation faces similar questions. How should power be used? Which traditions deserve protection? When is change necessary? What responsibilities do people have toward future generations? The Habsburg dynasty does not provide easy answers, but it offers valuable examples for reflection. By studying their successes and failures, we gain a deeper understanding of how history works and how decisions can echo far beyond the moment in which they are made. That is why, centuries after the height of their influence, people continue reading about them, visiting their palaces, and debating their legacy. The dynasty may belong to the past, but the lessons hidden within its story remain very much alive. And as long as people remain curious about history, the remarkable journey of the Habsburgs will continue to be remembered, studied, and discussed by generations yet to come. As historians continue examining the Habsburg legacy, one fact becomes increasingly clear. Their story is not merely about the rise and fall of a dynasty, but about the broader forces that shape human history. Empires emerge because people believe they can create lasting systems of order and stability. For a time, those systems may appear permanent. Roads are built, laws are established, institutions grow stronger, and generations come to view the existing order as natural. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that permanence is often an illusion. Every political system, no matter how successful, eventually encounters challenges it was not designed to face. The Habsburgs experienced this reality over centuries. They adapted to some changes and struggled with others. At times, they seemed unstoppable. At other moments, they appeared vulnerable. This mixture of strength and weakness is what makes their history feel so authentic. Real human stories are rarely defined by constant success or constant failure. Instead, they unfold through a series of victories, setbacks, opportunities, and unexpected consequences. The Habsburg Dynasty followed that pattern on a grand scale. Their rulers witnessed wars, scientific discoveries, religious conflicts, cultural transformations, and political revolutions. Few families were positioned so close to so many major events. Because of this, studying the Habsburgs often feels like studying Europe itself. Their history intersects with countless other stories, connecting different countries, cultures, and generations. Every new document uncovered in an archive adds another piece to this enormous puzzle. Sometimes the discoveries are dramatic. Sometimes they are surprisingly ordinary. Yet together they help us understand how people lived, thought, and made decisions in a very different world. Perhaps that is why historical research never truly ends. Each generation asks new questions and examines old evidence from fresh perspectives. The Habsburg Dynasty remains a rich source of insight because its history contains so many layers. Political ambition, family loyalty, personal sacrifice, cultural achievement, and human error all appear within the same story. Few subjects offer such a complete picture of the complexities that define the past. And as long as people remain curious about how societies rise, change, and eventually transform, the Habsburgs will continue to provide valuable lessons. Their empire may have faded, but their story remains a reminder that history is not only something that happened long ago. It is an ongoing conversation between the past and the present, helping us better understand both where we came from and where we might be going. In more ways, the Habsburg Dynasty serves as a reminder that history is filled with paradoxes, the same family that became famous for preserving its power through careful planning also demonstrates how impossible it is to control every outcome. Their rulers spent centuries thinking about the future. They arranged alliances, managed territories, and sought to secure stability for generations yet unborn. Nevertheless, events unfolded in ways they could never fully anticipate. This tension between planning and uncertainty lies at the heart of the human experience. People naturally want to shape the future, but history shows that even the most powerful individuals can only influence part of what happens next. The Habsburgs understood diplomacy, warfare, and government better than most, yet they remained subject to forces beyond their control, including changing social attitudes, technological developments, economic shifts, and the passage of time itself. Looking back, it is easy to focus on the dramatic moments, the royal weddings, the political conflicts, the succession crises, and the eventual decline of imperial authority. But history is also built from quieter moments. Conversations in palace corridors, decisions made during private meetings, letters written late at night, small choices that seemed insignificant at the time but later proved important. The Habsburg story contains countless examples of this phenomenon. A marriage agreement signed in one generation could influence events decades later. A political compromise might create consequences nobody expected. History often advances through these chains of connected events, each link shaping the next. This is one reason historians continue finding new insights within the dynasty's long history. Every generation of researchers notices different patterns and asks different questions. What remains constant, however, is the recognition that the Habsburgs were deeply human despite their extraordinary status. They celebrated victories, worried about failures, hoped for the future, and feared uncertainty. Their titles may have been grand, but their experiences often reflected universal concerns. Perhaps that is why their story still resonates today. It reminds us that history is not simply a record of governments and empires. It is also a collection of human lives connected across time. The Habsburg Dynasty left behind palaces, documents, and monuments. But its most enduring legacy may be the opportunity it provides to reflect on ambition, responsibility, and the unpredictable nature of history itself. And with every new study, every newly discovered letter, and every fresh interpretation, the story continues to reveal details that keep it alive for future generations. Another fascinating aspect of the Habsburg Dynasty is how differently it has been remembered over time. During its height, many people viewed the family as a symbol of stability and authority. Later generations sometimes focused on its weaknesses and failures. Modern historians tend to see a more balanced picture. They recognize that the dynasty was neither a perfect success nor a complete failure. Instead, it was a complex institution that survived for centuries in an ever-changing world. Few ruling families remained influential for so long. That longevity alone makes the Habsburgs remarkable. Maintaining power across multiple centuries required adaptability, determination, and political skill. At the same time, the dynasty's history reveals the risks that can emerge when traditions become too deeply entrenched. The challenge faced by the Habsburgs was not unique. Many powerful institutions throughout history have struggled to distinguish between practices that remain useful and practices that have outlived their purpose. This tension continues to exist in modern societies. Organizations, governments, and communities still wrestle with the question of how much change is necessary and how much continuity should be preserved. In Cisenza, the Habsburg story feels surprisingly contemporary despite taking place hundreds of years ago. It reminds us that every generation inherits systems created by those who came before. Some of those systems provide stability and strength. Others may require reform. Determining the difference is rarely easy. Looking at the dynasty today, we can appreciate both its achievements and its limitations. The Habsburg rulers helped shape the political and cultural landscape of Europe. Their influence can still be seen in architecture, art, and historical traditions. Yet their story also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming that past success guarantees future security. History rarely works that way. Every era presents new challenges that demand new responses. The families and institutions that endure are often those capable of learning, adapting, and evolving when circumstances change. The Habsburgs succeeded in doing this at certain moments and struggled at others. Their long history reflects both realities, and perhaps that balance is what keeps people interested in them today. They were powerful but not invincible, successful but not flawless, influential yet still constrained by the same uncertainties that affect all human beings. Their story continues to endure because it captures something fundamental about history itself. the constant interaction between ambition, tradition, change, and the unpredictable consequences that emerge over time. Perhaps the reason the Habsburg Dynasty continues to fascinate people is that its story feels both extraordinary and familiar at the same time. On one hand, it is a tale of emperors, royal courts, vast territories, and immense influence. Few families in history ever reached such heights. On the other hand, the challenges they faced were deeply human. They worried about the future. They hoped to protect their families. They made decisions based on the knowledge available to them and dealt with consequences they could not always predict. In Setsense, the distance between a ruler in a palace and an ordinary person may not be as great as it first appears. Both must navigate uncertainty. Both must make choices without knowing exactly what the future holds. This human dimension is what transforms the Habsburgs from a historical curiosity into a meaningful story. Their successes inspire admiration, while their mistakes encourage reflection. Neither can be understood without the other. The dynasty endured because it possessed remarkable strengths. Yet those same strengths sometimes produced unexpected weaknesses. History is full of such contradictions. Power creates opportunities, but it also creates pressures. Stability brings security, but it can sometimes make change more difficult. Traditions preserve identity, but they can also limit flexibility. The Habsburg experience illustrates all of these realities. As centuries passed, the family became one of the most recognizable symbols of European monarchy. Their influence reached into politics, culture, diplomacy, and society. Yet, even at the height of their authority, they remained part of a world that was constantly evolving. New ideas emerged. Old assumptions were challenged. Future generations inherited circumstances very different from those faced by their ancestors. Adapting to those changes was never simple. Some rulers succeeded better than others, but none could stop history from moving forward. That may be the deepest lesson hidden within the Habsburg story. No matter how powerful a dynasty becomes, it cannot stand outside the flow of time. Every institution, every empire, and every family must eventually respond to changing circumstances. Some adapt successfully. Others struggle. The Habsburgs experience both outcomes at different moments in their long history. Their journey remains fascinating not because it was perfect, but because it was so profoundly human. And that humanity is what continues to keep their story alive long after the empire itself has faded into the pages of history. If there is one final observation historians often make about the Habsburg dynasty, it is that history rarely rewards certainty. Throughout their long existence, Habsburg rulers frequently believed they had secured the future. A successful alliance, a favourable treaty, a strategic marriage, or a military victory could create the impression that stability had been achieved. Yet, each generation eventually discovered that new challenges were waiting just beyond the horizon. This pattern is visible not only in royal history but throughout human experience. Every era solves certain problems while creating new ones. The Habsburgs were exceptionally skilled at overcoming many of the obstacles they encountered. That skill helped them remain influential for centuries. However, even extraordinary success could not eliminate uncertainty completely. the future always remained partly beyond their control. Looking at their story today, we can appreciate how remarkable their achievements truly were. Few dynasties survived as long. Few accumulated as much influence. Few left behind such an extensive historical record. Their legacy stretches across art, architecture, politics, and culture. Entire chapters of European history cannot be understood without considering the role they played. Yet, perhaps the most valuable part of their legacy lies in the lessons their experience provides. The dynasty reminds us that strength and vulnerability often coexist. The qualities that help people achieve success can sometimes create unexpected risks. Traditions that provide stability may eventually require reconsideration. Decisions made with the best intentions can produce outcomes nobody anticipates. These realities are not unique to emperors and kings. They apply to individuals, families, organizations, and societies alike. That is why the Habsburg story continues to resonate. Centuries after the empire disappeared, it speaks to questions that remain relevant in every age. How should people balance continuity with change? How can success be preserved without becoming a limitation? And how can anyone prepare for consequences that may not appear for generations? The Habsburgs never fully solved these challenges, but their history offers countless examples of how such questions shape the course of human events. Their journey began with ambition, expanded through opportunity, and evolved through centuries of triumphs and setbacks. By the end, they had become more than a royal family. They had become a symbol of the complex relationship between power, tradition, and time itself. And that relationship continues to fascinate historians, ensuring that the story of the Habsburg Dynasty remains alive long after the last echoes of its empire have faded away. As historians reflect on the Habsburg Dynasty today, they often emphasize that its greatest significance extends beyond the family itself. The dynasty serves as a window into how societies function across long periods of time. Through the Habsburgs, we can observe the rise of empires, the evolution of governments, the development of diplomacy, and the changing relationship between rulers and the people they governed. Their history stretches across so many centuries that it almost feels like a bridge connecting different eras of European civilization. Few dynasties remained present through so many transformations. They witnessed the end of the medieval world, the growth of powerful kingdoms, the spread of new ideas, and the emergence of modern states. Each generation faced challenges that would have seemed unimaginable to its predecessors. Yet despite these changes, the family attempted to preserve a sense of continuity. That effort became one of the defining characteristics of the dynasty. Continuity provided strength, but it also created difficulties when adaptation became necessary. This balance between stability and change appears repeatedly throughout history. Societies need traditions to maintain identity, yet they also require flexibility to respond to new circumstances. Finding the right balance is never easy. The Habsburg experience illustrates both the benefits and the risks involved. Their long survival demonstrates the value of strong institutions and careful planning. Their struggles reveal the dangers of relying too heavily on familiar solutions when the world is evolving. Because of this, the dynasty remains relevant far beyond the specific details of royal history. It offers insights into leadership, decision-making, and the unintended consequences that can emerge over time. These lessons apply to many different contexts, not just imperial courts. Whether examining governments, organizations, or families, similar patterns often appear. Success creates opportunities, but it can also create blind spots. Traditions provide stability, but they may eventually require adjustment. The future is shaped not only by major events, but also by countless small decisions accumulated across generations. The Habsburg story captures all of these themes in a way few historical subjects can. That is why scholars continue studying the dynasty and why audiences continue finding it fascinating. Long after the empire disappeared, its history remains a source of reflection and discovery. And with every new generation that encounters the story, the legacy of the Habsburgs gains another opportunity to teach, to caution, and to inspire curiosity about the remarkable complexity of the human past. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Habsburg Dynasty is that its story has outlived the empire itself. Millions of people who have never visited Vienna, Madrid, or Prague still recognize the name. They may not remember every emperor or every battle, but they remember the larger lesson hidden within the dynasty's history. Power can last for a long time, sometimes for centuries, but it never remains completely secure. Every generation inherits both advantages and problems from those who came before. What people choose to do with that inheritance helps shape the future. The Habsburgs inherited one of the most powerful political systems in Europe and spent generations trying to preserve it. Sometimes they succeeded brilliantly. At other times, they struggled against challenges that grew larger with each passing decade. Their story demonstrates that history is rarely a straight line. Progress is often followed by setbacks. Stability can give way to uncertainty. Decisions made with confidence may produce outcomes nobody expected. These patterns appear throughout the human past and continue to appear today. That is one reason historians find the Habsburgs so valuable as a subject of study. The dynasty provides an opportunity to examine how power operates over long periods of time. It reveals strengths that help institutions endure and the weaknesses that can slowly undermine them. Most importantly, it reminds us that history is created by people rather than abstract forces alone. Behind every treaty, every royal marriage, and every political decision stood individuals, trying to navigate a complicated world. Some made wise choices. Others made costly mistakes. Most did a combination of both. Looking back across the centuries, it becomes clear that the Habsburgs were neither heroes nor villains. They were human beings living within the circumstances of their era. Their achievements were real. Their failures were real as well. Together, they created a story that continues to captivate audiences because it reflects the complexity of human experience itself. Few dynasties have left behind such a rich legacy of triumph, tragedy, ambition, and consequence. And perhaps that is why their history remains so compelling. It is not simply the story of a family that ruled Europe. It is the story of how power arises, how it changes, and how even the greatest empires eventually become part of the past. leaving future generations to learn from what came before. Even after all these centuries, the Habsburg Dynasty remains a reminder that history is never truly finished. New generations continue asking questions, revisiting old evidence, and discovering fresh perspectives on familiar events. A portrait that once seemed ordinary may reveal new clues. A forgotten letter found in an archive may shed light on a long-standing mystery. Historical understanding grows over time, and the Habsburgs provide one of the richest collections of material for that ongoing exploration. Their story survives because it contains so many layers. It is a political story about power and empire. It is a family story about inheritance and responsibility. It is a social story about traditions and expectations. It is even a scientific story that later generations would examine through the lens of genetics and medicine. Few historical subjects connect so many different fields of study. This broad appeal ensures that the dynasty remains relevant to historians, students, and curious readers alike. Yet, beneath all the details lies a simple truth. The Habsburgs spent centuries trying to create permanence in a world defined by change. They built institutions, forged alliances, and established traditions designed to endure. Many of those achievements lasted far longer than anyone could have expected. But time continued moving forward. New challenges emerged. The world evolved. Eventually, the empire that had once seemed permanent became part of history. This outcome does not diminish what the dynasty accomplished. If anything, it highlights how extraordinary their longevity truly was. Few families have exercised influence over such a vast area for such a long period. Their successes shaped nations. Their decisions affected millions of lives. Their legacy remains visible even now. At the same time, their story reminds us that no amount of power can completely stop change. Every generation must confront new realities. Every institution must adapt or risk falling behind. These lessons remain just as important today as they were centuries ago. That is why the Habsburg Dynasty continues to fascinate people around the world. It offers more than historical facts. It offers insight into how societies function, how leaders make decisions, and how the consequences of those decisions can echo through time. The empire may be gone, but the questions raised by its history remain alive. And as long as people remain curious about the past, the remarkable story of the Habsburgs will continue to be told, studied and remembered. For many people, the Habsburg Dynasty represents one of history's greatest examples of how success and vulnerability can exist side by side. Their rulers possessed resources that most people could scarcely imagine. They commanded armies, negotiated with kings, and governed territories stretching across vast distances. Yet despite all of that power, they faced limitations that no wealth or authority could completely overcome. This contrast gives their story a timeless quality. It reminds us that influence does not remove uncertainty from life. In every era, people must make decisions without knowing exactly how those choices will shape the future. The Habsburgs faced that reality on a larger stage than most, but the principle remains the same. Looking back across their centuries of rule, we can see how one generation influenced the next. Traditions established long ago continued, affecting people who had never met the ancestors responsible for creating them. policies designed to solve immediate problems sometimes produced unexpected consequences many decades later. This long chain of cause and effect is one of the reasons history is so valuable. It teaches us that events are rarely isolated. The present is connected to the past, and the future will be shaped by decisions being made today. The Habsburg Dynasty illustrates this process with remarkable clarity. Their achievements demonstrate what determined leadership and strong institutions can accomplish. Their difficulties reveal the importance of adaptation and self-examination. Neither lesson is complete without the other. That balance is what makes their story so enduring. Historians continue studying the dynasty not because it was perfect, but because it was complex. Real history is rarely simple. It involves competing priorities, unintended outcomes, and people doing their best within the limits of their knowledge. The Habsburgs experienced all of these realities. They left behind victories worth remembering and mistakes worth understanding. Together, those experiences created a legacy far larger than any single ruler or generation. Today, centuries after their influence reached its peak, the dynasty remains a subject of fascination because it reflects fundamental truths about human societies. Power changes, institutions evolve, traditions are tested. Yet the questions people ask about leadership, responsibility, and the future remain remarkably consistent. Historians are not about the past. It is also about the challenges that every generation faces as it tries to build something lasting in a world that never stops changing. As we continue reflecting on the Habsburg dynasty, it becomes clear that one of its most important legacies is the perspective it offers on the passage of time. Human lives are short, but institutions can survive for centuries. Because of this, the consequences of decisions are not always visible to the people who make them. A ruler may begin a policy believing it will solve a problem for his generation, only for its effects to be felt many decades later by descendants he will never meet. The Habsburg story contains many examples of this phenomenon. Choices made in one century often influenced events in the next. The dynasty's long history allows us to observe these connections more clearly than we can in shorter historical periods. It is almost like watching history unfold in slow motion. We can see how traditions develop, how habits become expectations, and how expectations eventually shape entire systems of government and family life. This perspective is valuable because it encourages patience and reflection. History rarely changes overnight. Most transformations occur gradually, through the accumulation of countless small decisions. The Habsburgs rose to prominence through such a process, and many of their difficulties developed in the same way. Their experience reminds us that understanding the present often requires looking far into the past. It also highlights the importance of learning from earlier generations. Every society inherits both achievements and challenges from those who came before. The question is how those inheritances are managed. Some are strengthened and expanded. Others are reformed or abandoned. The choices made in response help determine the direction of the future. The Habsburg dynasty offers a particularly rich example because its history spans so many generations. Through their story, we can observe how power is gained, maintained, challenged, and ultimately transformed, we can see how individuals respond to uncertainty and how institutions attempt to adapt to changing circumstances. These themes are not limited to royal families. They apply to all human societies. That is why the Habsburgs continue, attracting attention long after their political influence disappeared. Their story speaks to questions that remain relevant in every age. How should people prepare for the future? How should traditions be balanced with innovation? And how can leaders recognize when old solutions are no longer sufficient for new problems? The Habsburg Dynasty never found perfect answers, but it's long and remarkable. History provides countless opportunities to reflect on these enduring challenges. Another reason the Habsburg Dynasty remains such a powerful historical example is that it demonstrates how closely connected personal decisions and public events can become. At first glance, a royal marriage may seem like a private family matter. Yet, in the world of European monarchies, such decisions often influence diplomacy, succession, alliances, and even the possibility of war. The boundary between personal life and political life was often blurred. A single marriage contract could affect the future of entire kingdoms. This reality placed enormous pressure on members of the dynasty. Their choices rarely belonged to them alone. Expectations from advisors, nobles, foreign rulers, and family members all shaped the decisions they were expected to make. Understanding this environment helps explain why certain traditions endured for so long. People often continued following established practices because changing them seemed risky or unpredictable. In cases, maintaining continuity appeared safer than experimenting with something new. Yet history repeatedly shows that avoiding change can carry risks of its own. The Habsburg experience illustrates this lesson clearly. Some of the challenges that later generations faced were connected to decisions made long before those individuals were born. This pattern reminds us that history operates across much larger timescales than a single human life. Consequences can travel across decades and centuries, influencing people who had no role in the original decision. That idea can feel surprising, but it appears throughout history. Institutions, traditions, and systems often outlive the people who create them. Their effects continue long after the original circumstances have been forgotten. The Habsburg Dynasty provides an unusually detailed example of this process because its records survived so extensively. Through those records, historians can trace connections across generations and observe how the past shaped the future. Few historical subjects allow such a clear view of long-term cause and effect. This is one reason the dynasty continues attracting attention from scholars around the world. Its story offers more than drama and intrigue. It offers insight into the mechanisms through which history unfolds. The Habsburgs remind us that every generation inherits a world shaped by earlier choices. They also remind us that the decisions made today may influence people far into the future. That lesson extends far beyond the walls of any palace. It applies to families, communities, governments, and societies everywhere. And perhaps that is why the Habsburg story continues to feel meaningful centuries after the empire itself became part of history. When all is said and done, the Habsburg dynasty leaves behind something more valuable than political power: perspective. Empires rise and fall. Borders change. Governments come and go. Yet the lessons hidden within history often survive much longer than the institutions that created them. The Habsburgs ruled for centuries, but the questions raised by their experience continue to matter today. How should leaders balance tradition and change? How can people recognize risks before they become crises? What responsibilities do individuals have toward future generations? These are not questions limited to kings and emperors. They are questions faced by societies in every era. Looking across the long arc of Habsburg history, one theme appears again and again: adaptation. The world around the dynasty never stood still. New technologies emerged. Economies evolved. Political ideas changed. Some rulers responded effectively, while others struggled to keep pace. Their successes and failures alike reveal how important it is to remain flexible in a changing environment. Stability is valuable, but so is the ability to learn and adjust when circumstances demand it. This lesson helps explain why the Habsburg story remains relevant, even in the modern world. Although the specific details belong to another era, the underlying challenges remain familiar. Every generation inherits traditions from the past while trying to prepare for the future. Deciding what to preserve and what to change is never simple. The Habsburgs faced that dilemma repeatedly, and their experiences offer insight into the opportunities and dangers involved. Perhaps that is why their story continues attracting attention long after their empire disappeared. It combines the grandeur of royal history with questions that affect everyone. Beneath the crowns, palaces, and ceremonies were people attempting to navigate uncertainty. They wanted security, prosperity, and continuity for those who would come after them. In that respect, they were not so different from people today. The scale of their influence was extraordinary, but many of their hopes and fears were universal. And so the Habsburg Dynasty endures not only as a historical subject, but also as a reminder of how closely the past and present are connected. Every generation contributes a new chapter to the larger story of humanity. The Habsburgs wrote one of the most remarkable chapters of all, and the echoes of that chapter continue to be heard centuries later by those willing to listen. As our journey through the history of the Habsburg dynasty comes to an end, perhaps the most important thing to remember is that history is ultimately a story about people. The Habsburgs may have worn crowns and ruled vast territories, but they were still human beings living in an uncertain world. They hoped, feared, planned, succeeded, and failed just like countless others throughout history. Their decisions shaped nations, influenced generations, and left a legacy that continues to be studied centuries later. Yet they could never completely control the future. No ruler ever can. Time moves forward, circumstances change, and every generation faces challenges that its predecessors could not fully predict. The Habsburg dynasty rose from regional nobles to become one of the most powerful families Europe had ever known. Their influence stretched across kingdoms and empires. They built magnificent palaces, supported culture and learning, and played a central role in shaping the continent's history. At the same time, their story reveals the dangers of becoming too dependent on old assumptions and traditions. It demonstrates how strengths can sometimes become weaknesses, and how choices made with the best intentions can produce unexpected consequences many years later. Today, the empire they ruled has disappeared. The banners that once flew over their territories are gone. The rulers themselves belong to another age. Yet their story survives. It survives in museums, archives, castles, portraits, and in the curiosity of people who continue asking questions about the past. Every generation rediscovers the Habsburgs and finds new lessons hidden within their remarkable journey. Perhaps that is the true power of history. It allows us to learn from lives that ended long ago. It reminds us that success is never guaranteed, that change is inevitable, and that the decisions we make today may influence people far into the future. The Habsburg Dynasty stands as one of history's most fascinating examples of these truths. Their rise was extraordinary. Their challenges were profound. Their legacy remains unforgettable. And now, as the lights of the royal palaces fade into the distance and the echoes of emperors and kings grow quiet, we leave the Habsburgs where they belong in the pages of history, still teaching, still fascinating, and still reminding us that even the mightiest dynasties are ultimately part of a much larger human story. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of Europe's most remarkable dynasties. Rest well, and until our next story, good night.